Katherine Stevens had always been the perfect mother, devout, loving, and deeply committed to her family. But when her 19-year-old son, Luke, became the object of her darkest desires, everything they had known unraveled. As her obsession grew, Katherine twisted the very scriptures she once preached, believing that the Bible justified her actions. The small town of Oak Ridge would never be the same again after the shocking secrets of the Stevens family were exposed, and the line between faith and insanity blurred beyond recognition. The Stevens family lived in a picture-perfect home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in the small town of Oak Ridge. Katherine Stevens, 41, was the epitome of a devoted mother, always involved in her children's lives, running a tight ship at home, and volunteering at church. Her two children, Luke and his younger sister Emily, seemed to grow up without a hitch. They attended school, played sports, and were admired by neighbors for their polite behavior and loving home. Katherine's devotion to the church was legendary in Oak Ridge. She spent hours at the local community center teaching Sunday school, organizing charity events, and even leading a Bible study group in the evenings. Her husband, Greg, was a quiet man, a hard worker, but often distant due to the demands of his job. Despite his absence, the family seemed perfectly functional. But as Luke reached the age of 19, things began to shift. The once close bond between mother and son started to grow unsettlingly intense. Luke had always been a sensitive and reserved young man, close to his mother in a way that seemed normal to outsiders, perhaps a little too close, but nothing alarming. But Katherine began to see something in him that disturbed her. She felt a possessiveness over Luke, a connection that, in her mind, was unlike the relationship she had with anyone else. She often found herself staring at him for longer than was comfortable, watching him as he became a man. Her feelings began to creep into darker territories, and she found herself torn between love and an overwhelming urge she could not deny. The more she tried to suppress it, the stronger the pull became. One afternoon, Katherine found an old Bible in the attic. Dusty with frayed edges, it had belonged to her grandmother. As she flipped through its pages, Katherine's eyes settled on a passage in Leviticus that seemed to speak to her directly. "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother." Yet, in the context of her devout beliefs, Katherine found solace in other interpretations of the Bible. The verses seemed to justify her desires, and she began to see herself and Luke not as mother and son, but as partners in a divine bond. Katherine's obsession deepened. She began to slowly but unmistakably change her behavior towards Luke. Her affections became more overt, although they were carefully hidden from the rest of the world. She began to buy him gifts, items that seemed far more personal than what one might gift a son, such as cologne, expensive watches, and even intimate items like silk sheets for his bed. Katherine also found excuses to spend time alone with him, late-night walks, movie nights, and trips to the store. At the same time, Luke, while still unaware of his mother's true intentions, began to sense a growing unease within him. He had always admired his mother, but there were moments when he felt her attention on him was almost too intense. He would catch her staring at him in ways he didn't fully understand. It made him uncomfortable, but he had never questioned their bond before. It was only after a particularly long hug that seemed to last far too long that the first seeds of doubt were planted in his mind. But he quickly dismissed it, assuming it was just his paranoia. One evening, Katherine suggested a mother-son bonding night, where they would stay up late, talk about the future, and enjoy each other's company. They watched a documentary together, but Katherine found herself so fixated on Luke's physical presence that she couldn't concentrate on the screen. Her eyes lingered on him, and her thoughts spiraled out of control. Luke, meanwhile, had no idea what was going on. His mother's strange behavior only confused him. But there was a darker undertone to their connection now, one that he couldn't explain. And so, he retreated into himself, avoiding friends and his sister, Emily, while becoming increasingly focused on his mother's demands for his attention. The more he withdrew from the outside world, the more Katherine had him to herself. By this point, the people around the Stevens family began to notice oddities. Katherine's absence from church became more frequent, and when she did attend, her presence felt off. She no longer greeted people with her usual warmth. Instead, she stood at the back of the congregation, her eyes distant, almost hollow. Neighbors started whispering about the Stevens household. They had always been the epitome of the perfect family, but now cracks were beginning to show. One neighbor, a woman named Susan, decided to check in on Katherine. Susan and Katherine had once been close friends, but they had drifted apart as their children grew older. Susan had heard that Katherine had been feeling unwell and wanted to make sure everything was okay. When Susan arrived at the Stevens house, she noticed Luke wasn't around. Katherine greeted her at the door with a forced smile, her eyes wild, as though she had just awoken from a bad dream. Katherine invited Susan inside, but the atmosphere was tense. There was a strange energy in the air, and Katherine's behavior was unsettling. She spoke of her spiritual journey with fervor, her words flowing rapidly, as if trying to justify something. Susan, ever the concerned friend, asked about Luke. Katherine's response was quick and almost defensive. "He's growing up," Katherine said, her voice flat. "He's figuring things out on his own now." Yet Susan could sense something was wrong. Katherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. The weight of her silence made Susan uncomfortable, and she left shortly after, her suspicion growing. It wasn't long before the truth came crashing to the surface. One night, after a loud argument was overheard by neighbors, the police were called to the Stevens home. What they found was beyond anyone's imagination. Luke, standing outside the home, was shaking uncontrollably. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror. When the officers entered the house, they found Katherine in a state of madness, clinging to her Bible. Her words were disjointed, but one thing was clear. She believed that her relationship with Luke was not just acceptable, but divinely ordained. The police scoured the house and found a hidden room in the attic. Inside, there were journals, dozens of them. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, chronicling Katherine's thoughts, her obsession with Luke, and her increasing belief that their relationship was not only justified, but part of a divine plan. She had twisted Scripture and used it to fuel her delusions, seeing herself as a vessel for something far greater. In her journals, Katherine detailed her encounters with Luke in graphic detail, describing them as sacred, even holy. She believed that the Bible, in its original context, allowed her to be with her son in the most intimate ways. The police were horrified by the extent of the delusion, and they immediately arrested Katherine. Luke, traumatized and unable to speak, was taken to a hospital for psychological evaluation. His mind was shattered, torn between guilt, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. He had been unable to stop his mother, and now all he could do was try to understand what had happened. The trial that followed was nothing short of a media circus. Katherine's defense lawyer argued that she was suffering from a severe mental illness, caused by her obsessive belief that her actions were justified by her faith. Her lawyer presented her journals as evidence of her delusions, claiming that Katherine truly believed she was carrying out God's will. For many in the community, the trial was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The woman they had once admired had become the villain of a dark, twisted tale. Katherine was ultimately convicted of child abuse, incest, and other charges, but her defense made it clear that she would spend the rest of her life in a psychiatric facility. As for Luke, the damage was far deeper than anyone could comprehend. Though he was given therapy, he became a shell of the person he had once been. He withdrew from his peers, unable to talk about the horrors he had endured. The town that once saw the Stevens family as perfect was left with a gaping wound. The scandal would haunt them forever, and the question remained, how did such a horrific betrayal happen in a family that seemed so normal? For Katherine, the Bible would always be her justification, but the cost of her actions was unbearable. The scars left on Luke, both physical and psychological, would last a lifetime, and the town of Oak Ridge would never be the same.